Brought to you by Prep Matters and the Self-Driven Child.
So I really encourage parents to do their own I call it their deep inner work. It is uncomfortable. It is not fun, but it involves things like really first confronting our own subconscious biases that we have against ADHD or other labels or neurodivergence. We have to really get all of our fears out on the table. We have to kind of give them voice so we can deal with them, recognize them, and then start to lean into who our child actually is. Like that is where all of the work happens.
How important are standardized tests?
Why isn't my child doing well in school?
Do you need a high school diploma to apply to Harvard?
Education is one of our most cherished institutions, but it can also be one of our most exasperating. And it's where almost all of our children go, from toddlers learning their ABCs to critically thinking adults stepping out into the world. I talk with experts in helping teens and tweens navigate the transition to adulthood in order to bring you the tools you need to help grow resilient, self-driven, and successful young adults. I'm Ned Johnson, and this is Prep Talks. Debbie Reber is a parenting activist, New York Times bestselling author, and the founder of Tilt Parenting, a top podcast, community, and educational resource for parents raising differently wired children. Her most recent book, Differently Wired: Raising an Exceptional Child in a Conventional World, came out in June 2018. After living abroad in the Netherlands for the past 5 years, Debbie, her husband, and teenage son recently moved back to New York City. Debbie, welcome.
Thank you, Ned. I'm happy to be here.
I'm delighted to have you. So let's jump right in. So let's start. Why did you write this book? I mean, there's so many great books, in this pantheon, and of course yours is right there at the top. But give us the backstory.
Well, I will say that I have been writing books for almost 20 years. So I've always, since I left the corporate world in 2003, I've identified as a author and as a writer, and I used to write self-help books for teenagers, a lot focused on girls. And so as I kind of got into kind of realized what I was dealing with as a parent and recognized I was going down a different path, I always knew I was going to write a book at some point. And in fact, I would meet with my agent and she would be like, yep, you're going to write about this, but you have to keep living it for now. And so I kind of always knew that I wanted to, at a certain point, share my experience, because as a writer, what I'm really good at is learning from a lot of different resources, applying strategies in my own life, and then sharing them in a way that other people can more easily access them or try them in their own world. And so I knew that I wanted to take those skills and use them to support other parents who, like me, are raising kids who are in some way neurologically atypical, and these parents are feeling kind of lost and overwhelmed and isolated. So that was the initial. In fact, the book idea came before I even created Tilt Parenting. I kind of always had it in the back of my mind.
Well, the book certainly does that really well. I mean, it is particularly those opening chapters are so raw. I mean, even now that the uncertainty and the struggle and just the honesty it's palpable. For those who haven't read the book, you will identify with it if you have kids who are neurologically atypical. But it doesn't end on a sad place. It ends in a very hopeful way. So you got to read the book. Let's back up and explain to us, just sort of broad way, what we mean when we talk. What you mean when you talk about differently wired? Because some people might say, "Well, gosh, isn't that kind of a overly broad category?" Maybe you could walk us through what people kind of classically think of as differently wired, and what are some of the things that, to use your words, kind of kids who kind of fly under the radar for a while.
Mm-hmm. I will say that it is overly broad, and that is intentional because, there are so many ways that the brain, develops, and so many different ways of kind of being. And so I'll step back and just define differently wired in the way that I introduce it in the book. And I use that term to describe kids, people who are in any way neurologically atypical and may have an identification, a label such as ADHD, autism spectrum, giftedness, anxiety, learning disabilities like dyslexia, dysgraphia, could be anxiety, sensory processing issues, speed processing, like there's so many things, right? And the reason I wanted to make it more of a broad category is because a lot of these kids, as you say, fly under the radar. Their differences are often invisible. There's nothing outwardly evident to a teacher or a coach. These are kids whose behavior might just seem more extreme, or they're non-compliant, or they're disruptors, and I say that when they're young, that's a bad thing. When they're older, we want them to be disruptors, right? Because that's really prized in society. But I wanted to find a terminology that would kind of open up our arms to say, wow, there's a lot of us. These are not kids who are outliers or who deserve to be marginalized. In fact, if we really take a look at all the different ways that kids can kind of move through the world, it's a large percentage of kids who are in some way, quote unquote outliers. And so I really wanted to push back against this idea that there is a normal and then there is, an not normal or an atypical, but rather there are all of these variances, and we need to be more inclusive as a society.
I love your point that kids who are disruptive at a young age, right? They kind of can drive teachers crazy, and we sort of tamp that down. But then 15 or 20 years later, we want them to be, and it's like, well, hold up. Because you make such a nice point about some of the attributes of neurologically atypical kids. The things that make them challenging in a air quotes normal world are the same gifts that allow them to contribute in ways that are so wildly and wonderfully unexpected. Now, in that list, you put giftedness in there.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of people that like, wait a second, now isn't giftedness just a great, give me a break. Talk a little bit about how giftedness, has its pros and cons, and why we should really be paying attention to that when we think about neurodiversity as well.
Yeah, that was very deliberate. And actually, when I first launched Tilt Parenting, I got a lot of emails from people thanking me for including giftedness in the umbrella. And, I'm raising a profoundly gifted, twice exceptional teen, but I remember, he taught himself to read before he was 3. He was just one of those uber precocious kids and super intense. And, our first conversations with the parent coach, I'll never forget. I didn't think he was gifted. I probably had a knee-jerk reaction against that label, because I was like, I'm not going to be that parent who's saying my 3-year-old is gifted, right? And so this coach, I was on the phone with her and describing these things, and she said to me, she's like, listen, when a parent comes to me and says my child is gifted and they're really excited, I always know their kid's probably not gifted, because a true gifted kid is not great news for the most part, right? Because these kids are intense, they're complicated, they have asynchronous development. So they're often, they're emotional, age can be so lower than their same age peers, and then their intellect can be so much higher. And that disconnect can create so many challenges. These are kids who they can't just be, promoted grades or given more work. They actually approach everything in their life in a different way. And it was really important to me that we recognize that these aren't just bright kids who, we can have them ramp up a year or two in their math and they'll be fine. No, they actually, it's a special need in its own right, which is what this coach told me. And that really struck me.
Hmm.
And it's true. I mean, I'm very connected with the gifted community and was active with SANG, and these kids they have a lot of unique needs and they deserve to be supported and accommodated for those needs.
Hearing your point in the book about that asynchronous development, it made me think of children who are 99th percentile in terms of height. So it's a 4-year-old who appears to be a 6-year-old simply because of their height. And then we assume that, well, because this kid looks like a 6-year-old, this kid should have the self-control, the self-regulation of a 6-year-old. And it's like, no, just more height,
Yeah,
just bigger shoes.
exactly.
You mentioned labels in your last remark, and how labels can be in the book, how they can be helpful for us to kind of wrap our brains around what we're seeing, but also how labels can really be deeply stigmatizing, particularly ones that kind of miss the mark, that are deeply embedded in our culture and even daily conversation, but oftentimes in a not done in a purposeful or thoughtful way. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've observed and how, for those of us who are trying to do better, how do we break free of some of these patterns of language that are perhaps misplaced?
I think language is so problematic and it's super messy. So I hope that my answer is coherent to people. But so what I will say is that labels can be really helpful on the one hand, because they can provide context for challenges or, um, you know, traits for kids that can be confounding. And so having labels and those diagnoses can be really helpful. It can give context to teachers and that kind of thing. And yes, I believe certain labels of ADHD, I think, is one of the more maligned of neurodifferences. And that label has so much stigma that goes along with it. And so I also think it can be really empowering to reclaim that and, and not kind of treat it like it's a bad word, but kind of be more open. And I think more and more people are being open about their ADHD, their diagnoses. I'm seeing that with a lot more adults who are getting diagnosed as adults. And so I think that's how we kind of break down, the stigma. But also we have a real problem with pathologizing different neurodifferences. And so there's a lot of labels, the word disorder, I think is highly problematic. Epidemics of autism, anytime we kind of use language that pathologizes a neurodifference, a neurovariance, I think that's a problem. And at the same time, we want to recognize that having ADHD, having dyslexia, being on the autism spectrum, society was not set up to support these people, right? So they are disabled and that society isn't meeting their needs. So it's kind of this balance. I find a lot of my work with parents is helping them kind of just question the labels that they've been maybe assigned for their kids that might be more medicalized, that might have more negative connotation, and help them kind of reframe their thinking and also kind of empower them to own that and help their kids kind of feel good about those associations instead of thinking like it's a bad mark, that it's a negative stain on our resume or whatever it might be.
Yeah, you share that poignant vignette in the book when talking to your son about the risks of autism, and he's sort of head snapped, and you sound like in the telling that you handled it very well, and sort of agreed. Let's talk about the chances of having autism as opposed to the risks. To your point, to not pathologize it.
I will never forget that. Yeah, we were having this picnic, and yeah, he was like, what do they mean, the risks of having autism? What do they think it is, a disease? He was outraged. I was like,
Sure.
oh my gosh, like it's so pervasive, and it's just in the fabric of the media we consume, and so it takes vigilance and a constant questioning of the way that conversations are framed when we're talking about neurodivergence.
And I like that idea of questioning, because it seems to me that in popular culture, we have this, you make note of folks who are on the autism spectrum of kind of these one note savants, or people who have ADHD, clearly air quotes again, deserve the ridicule and the jokes at their expense, as though these are issues of character rather than chemistry. And I hadn't heard that line, but that if you know one person with autism, one person with autism, right? That we can't, that we need to be so careful about applying a label, a condition, a recognition of a difference, and thinking we know everything about that person. Complicated terrain, but I really like the I like the way that you talk about in the book, that it's something to be mindful without being scolding, because if you're ignorant, you're ignorant. It doesn't mean it's malevolent, but certainly we need to be moving in that direction, moving in the direction of being more thoughtful.
I will say too that even from in the past 5 years since I launched Tilt, and then I did, a paperback, an updated edition of my book, like a year and a half later, and the language has evolved this whole time. And so it's something to be always mindful of. Functioning labels in autism are not cool, like high functioning, low functioning. And Asperger's as a term is not considered okay, anymore. And so it's super messy, and I do think it's important because my community, a lot of times it's parents who are new to this journey, and so they are coming in with this lens of what they've heard from their pediatrician or the person who did the evaluation. And so it is a lot of what I think about is how do we kind of open up their thinking, and also really talking to actually autistic people and deferring to the thinking in these groups, people who are living with these neurodifferences, so that we're really following their lead and just supporting them in the work that we're doing.
So I'll show my own ignorance. If I were uncertain, kind of what's the kind of most current and sort of culturally appropriate language for for those communities, for someone who's not in the community, is your podcast a great place for this? Do I just Google? I mean, how do I try to avoid sticking my foot in my mouth because it doesn't taste very good?
Yeah, and certainly I have these conversations on my podcast, and I have at least 25% of my guests are neurodivergent in some way. So when I bring on a neurodivergent guest, we often dive into this territory at some point in the conversation. And then I always just recommend people follow on social media, Twitter or in Facebook groups, communities that are, again, there's some great actually autistic communities. That actually autistic is a hashtag on Twitter. But I will say, even within the autistic community, there are a lot of differing opinions because, as we said, you meet one autistic person, you know one autistic person. So
Right.
There is no one way, but I do try to follow the lead of those different communities.
Thank you. That's helpful. I imagine that for folks who are, have little people and they're starting to figure out, oh, I've got a kid who's atypical. There's a lot to process. There's a lot to unpack. And one of the things that seems to come through in your book is how much fear that can create. Because I think in many ways, the people cling to normal because normal equals safe, right? And as you start to realize, that's not the kid that I got. And so, fear of, my kid be made fun of, what will his future be like? What does it mean for them in the long run? How do we short circuit that pattern of, oh my gosh, I have I picture, 2.5 kids in a white picket fence and, whatever, job selling insurance. I have no idea. I'm making this up. It's like, well, my kid probably is not going to be there. How do we do that?
It's not easy, I will say. It's we have to confront it at a certain point. And so, there are many families who spend a lot of time, years in denial, and just kind of keep pushing and trying to fix their kid. fix with air quotes, but fix their kid to try to get them to comply with the vision they had for what their life is going to look like. But at a certain point, usually, hopefully, the rubber meets the road, if that's the right metaphor, and they say they realize this isn't working, and we need to try something different. And I think that fear really is the driver. It's the motivator for so many of the choices that we make as parents. I think all parents, because we do have this vision, this idea about what our kids' life and our family's life should look like. And so I really encourage parents to do their own I call it their deep inner work. It is uncomfortable. It is not fun, but it involves things like really first confronting our own subconscious biases that we have against ADHD or other labels or neurodivergence or people who are differently wired. We have to look at that. We have to really get all of our fears out on the table. Like the worst case scenario fears, my kid's going to be living under a bridge someday. They'll never launch. They'll never go to college. This will never happen. They'll never find love. Like we can, with our 3-year-old or our 5-year-old, we can have their whole future written out in the most negative way. And so we want to kind of give voice to those things because, just like what we're experiencing in society today, there's a lot of painful stuff going on that is just coming to the surface, and which it needs to come to light so we can deal with it. And the same comes with our own fears. We have to kind of give them voice so we can deal with them, recognize them, and then start to reframe our thinking and start to lean into who our child actually is. Like that is where all of the work happens, trying to reconcile that difference between our expectations for what life as a parent would be like and who our kids would be and what is actually happening, that reality. That's our work constantly, is to reconcile those two. And I think that's where the most pain happens, is when those two are out of alignment.
Seems to me that in addition to kind of the fear of my kid's going to end up, unhappy, living under a bridge kind of thing, there's also, I can imagine for most parents, a narrative of this perfect life that you imagine for them. And when we start to come to grips with, well, maybe not, I imagine there's also a bit of grieving for this imagined future for your kid.
Mm-hmm.
Though one of the things that seems to me, Debbie, is that this process of introspection, this process of figuring out who your kid is and really leaning into one of your tilts is, we'll talk about these more in a moment, is leading with possibility, not fear. And it seems to me that that's a process for every parent. My kid's supposed to be the quarterback of the football team, or, go to, an Ivy League school or whatever. And even if you have a kid who strikes you as more typical or neurotypical, all of us, I imagine, have work to do of recognizing, our kids are going to be who they're going to be. Mm-hmm. And it's really not our role or our right to hold to some specific vision of who they're supposed to be or what they're supposed to be.
Yeah, totally. I've been talking lately about that our kids are on their own hero's journey. And I think
like that.
Yeah, when we're raising, especially differently wired kids, we might be way more involved in our kids' lives than other parents, because we might be, schlepping them back and forth to therapies and, just more kind of in the trenches, and we can take it on as our journey. And it's not. Like, it is our child. Our child comes in, I believe this, they're all creative, resourceful, and whole. This is their life. It is their life to unfold, and our job is really as coaches, as supporters, to provide for them the best tools that we can, so that they can be who they're meant to be. And I think that you brought up sports, and I think that is such a great point. Like, I think for most parents, I was an athlete. My husband was a soccer player. I ran track in high school and some college. Like, that is a big part of my identity. my guy's not into sports at all. That is just not his thing. And I think that it happens for a lot of parents. And I think you use the word grief and mourn. And I think that recognizing it's okay to be sad about that, and that's for any parent. In some ways, our kids are not going to be the kids that we expect them to be. And the sooner we can kind of deal with our own grief around that and be like, it's totally fine. This is my own sadness. Maybe it's my own, I wanted to do better by my kid than my parents did by me. Maybe, I'm trying to resolve my childhood trauma in the way that I parent my child, but that's all our stuff, So if we can just deal with our own stuff and let our kids be who they are, and the sooner we can make that pivot and really do that work of seeing them as their own person, which is not easy, but that is where the good stuff comes. And I feel like that's what helps our relationships with our kids. That's what helps them have the agency and confidence to be who they're meant to be.
Love the kid you got, right?
Totally. Yeah. See, I could have just said all of that.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, I love your sharing about sports and the reality that you can continue to love running and being athletic, and the fact that your son grooves on other things doesn't take away from the way that you can enjoy that. Because I know that's one of the piece of advice you give towards the end of the book is having us really focus on our own self-care and things that give us joy. Because if all of our energy is in the ways that our kids are struggling or we think they're struggling, it doesn't paint a very happy or hopeful version of adulthood where we want our kids to grow into, right? Where if you are living, a fulfilling, joyous life and with challenges, right? It probably makes it easier for kids to think, I can see a place for myself in the adult world as opposed to just staying where I am.
Yeah, totally.
In the book, you compare differently wired people to people of color, to LGBTQ people, to immigrants, people living in poverty, and other groups in terms of the marginalization or kind of underrepresentation. And the point, it's an important one. What should we be thinking about in terms of supporting differently wired people who are also members of one or more of those groups?
Yes, that intersectionality is where
that was the word I was looking for.
Yeah. I it's something I'm trying to bring more to the podcast too, because, I think that certainly I've done several episodes and been talking with more and more people. We know that let's take giftedness, right? There is a huge conversation going on in this country about the lack of diversity in giftedness programs. In fact, in New York City here, they've just decided they're going to stop testing for gifted and talented programs because they are so unequal. There's so few kids of color identified as gifted. It's a huge problem. And I know the same thing happened in Seattle where I used to live. And so that is a conversation we just really need to be having. I had this great conversation with, her name is Maria Davis Pierre. She has an organization called Autism in Black. And we talked about just the cultural challenges for people of color when it comes to navigating the evaluation process. And there's a lot of mistrust in therapies and the diagnostic process. And overwhelmingly, the parenting, quote unquote, parenting expert space is white and straight. And so there are just so many different ways of being that are not easily accessed or represented when people are seeking guidance and support. Another interesting conversation that I've had and I'm seeing more and more in my community is there's a higher correlation of kids who are gender non-conforming or trans who are on the autism spectrum. And so that's another conversation we need to have. So I think that what I've learned, even in the 5 years since I've been, making this show and working within this community, is just how important it is to keep bringing in more and more voices and making sure that I'm seeking out more voices so we can be more inclusive. Because I think to be neurodivergent and a person of color, and LGBTQ and trans and, or having multiple of these differences is really challenging.
Mm. One of the things that occurs to me is when you talk about trying to understand these kids and diagnoses and that whole process, it can be frightening. It can be, uncertain. And particularly if you are engaging with things that are different, with people who are already different than you, who look different, who have different backgrounds, I think your point of having more people of color as one example, more LGBTQ, more, just having the people who are in these positions of helping, be as diverse as the people who are there helping creates a sort of psychological safety. And I would imagine make sure that all kids and not just rich white kids, get the help. Because otherwise, fundamentally, when I kept reading your book, I keep thinking of when you have these twice exceptional or you have kids who are just asynchronous, and we only see the problem, we don't see the promise.
Mm-hmm.
All of that human potential that just withers on the vine. And I don't know the data on it, but when you talk about gifted and talented programs in New York City, the idea that it's 1% Black and 25% white or whatever the numbers are, just, well, we're missing we're not developing a lot of opportunity. We're not seeing a lot of potential that's there.
Well, and also I'll just add that, research shows that kids of color, especially Black boys, are overwhelmingly they're just punished and disciplined at much higher rates for the same behavior in schools. And so the default reaction isn't going to be, oh, this kid might be gifted or this child might have a learning disability. The default reaction for many kids of color is this is a bad kid who needs more discipline. And so, these kids are pushed out of charter schools. They are the ones to be punished, expelled, disciplined at much higher rates. And, you kind of look at the school to prison pipeline and the percentage of incarcerated individuals with learning disabilities is incredible. It is a very, very high number. So there's absolutely a correlation. And there's so many kids that slip through the cracks because of these, subconscious biases and the way that behavior is perceived and culture isn't understood and respected.
I'm really, really glad you made that point. In the book, you talk about kids who are exceptional in a lot of ways, oftentimes are also have this really heightened sensitivity. It's sort of, the orchid dandelion, Boyce and Ellis hypothesis. And that high sensitivity, you make the point that we are comfortable, we're okay with kids who are highly sensitive crying, right? And just being really upset, but we're not okay with kids acting out. And that sensitivity, a more sensitive stress response is the freeze, fight, or flight response, right? And so some kids are going to, under too much perceived pressure, they're just going to melt down and they're going to cry and they're going to want to run away. But that's not true for everyone. Some kids, they fight back and they're tantrums and they're belligerent. And so a lot of times when we think about kids who have anger management problems or they're air quotes bad kids, it can be nothing more than they are just more sensitive to the world around them. And particularly, again, it's so easy to imagine how things go south really, really quickly. And what is this, hugely gifted child who just happens to be sensitive, and then we punish him rather than supporting him.
Yep. I had that angry kid. I mean, my kid was the one who would kick over a desk and get thrown out of class because his anxiety and stress response manifested in that way. And it really did a number on him. I homeschooled him for years to kind of get him out of that PTSD that he had residual, I think, from being just being ostracized by teachers and school administrators and kids alike when he was a little guy in school.
Yeah, you shared in the book where we'll tell the story about having to apologize. That kind of just broke my heart.
Yeah, it broke my heart too. And I'm actually fining him right now when he says I'm sorry for no reason. It's up to $3 a pop because I just want him to be more conscious of when he says sorry for no reason. But yeah, this happened many years ago. I don't remember the setup, but he said something to me. He's like, I'm sorry. He did something. And it's like, I'm sorry. I'm like, what are you apologizing for? You didn't do anything. And he's like, well, I don't know. I think I'm just used to it because I had to apologize all the time when I was in school because of my ADHD. And I was like, I'm sorry, can you back up and tell me more about that? And he's like, yeah, like anytime I did something, like I blurted out or I, you know, got distracted or wasn't paying attention, I was made to apologize. And I lost my mind. I was like, that is not okay. And I just the thought that this kid has been like regularly apologizing for who he is and making that mean something about himself, that he was flawed. Yeah, it was heartbreaking.
Apologize for who he is. That I can imagine that experience applies to way too many people. Because again, back, I mean, how many people are actually, again, quote unquote, normal in every way?
Yeah.
Before I shift over to the tilts, one of the things that I love in this book is the idea that things do get better. And I love your thinking on this, but three things that kind of jumped out to me were, one, that we get better, we have a better understanding, and we can find better learning or living arrangements for kids that are sensitive to kind of who they are and how they're wired. And then also that, particularly since your book's been written, and maybe because your book's been written, that we seem to have kind of more acceptance or better understanding of this neurodiversity generally. So I'm happy for that. For parents who suspect that their kid needs something more than what they're getting or something is not, what are things that parents should look for? When do they know it's not just, it's just the age? When should they be reaching out to a clinician or really having real conversations with their school administrators? I mean, for people who haven't walked this walk yet, when do you raise your hand and ask for help?
That it's really important that parents trust their guts on this. Oftentimes we may sense that our child is kind of, I call them the more kids, right? Their tantrums are more than their friends' kids, or they're more active, they're more sensitive. And so if we're starting to notice, and just in our peer group, that, oh, this is a little bit of a different experience, or I'm reading the same parenting book or using the same philosophy, and I'm getting very different results, those are signs that that you might want to kind of get a little more information. Certainly when our kids start preschool, that is when often we'll start getting more feedback from the school that, whether it's, your child isn't participating at all, and likes to be by him or herself all the time, or, or in my case, I was getting a lot of notes and a lot of phone calls because of things that happened on the playground and things that were very upsetting to my child, or disruptive. And so I think if we're starting to get that feedback, I recommend people start with their pediatrician, although we did, and our pediatrician was like, this is all normal within, this is in the range of normal developmental for your child. And in fact, I remember that conversation, and Ash was having a super chatty day and was talking about, I don't know, space robotics. I don't know what he was talking about, but the pediatrician was delighted. He was like, this is great. I don't see anything of concern here. But months later, we were going to a therapist for anger management for our whole family. So I think, as a parent, we want to trust our gut and our intuition. Talk to other people who really understand kids, and don't panic. That's what I would just say. Don't panic. And, it's not like if something's going on, you've got to do X, Y, and Z right away. Take a pause, take a breath, try to just get curious, try to start really paying attention to who your child is. Understood.org, I'm just going to say, is a really great resource for all kinds of learning and attention issues. And they have this new tool called Take Note. And it is a kind of a behavior tracker, and it will help you start to gather data. Like, we want to be researchers and start getting curious about this is interesting. I wonder if there's something that happened earlier today that could have resulted in this meltdown we're having right now. So we want to just start to notice behaviors and patterns. And and then start reaching out and seeing what kind of support is out there. But I would just remind people to take that pause, take a breath, not panic, and get curious.
One thought I was thinking about your that first experience with your pediatrician is that for a lot of kids who are more sensitive, that stress response is activated more by peers and learning environments than it is with adults. I have a kid who's like that who, I mean, just, adults just think she's the sun and the moon. But for years of her time in school, that thought was not shared by her peers at all. And so, adulthood, even a pediatrician who's trying, well educated, sees your kid in a 15-minute spot and your kid just happens to be having a good day. Well, you're fine, and dismisses your lived experience of the last several thousand hours. I wonder whether I've just popped to mind whether keeping a journal or keeping a kind of diary is, here's what we experienced on Tuesday and on Wednesday and Thursday, because to your point about doing research, providing data to people could be here, read this before you tell me what it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'd love to have you just another thought or two, if you have it. Those notes home from teachers and even particularly teachers who have lots of experience. I mean, those folks really can be, not always, but really can be our allies, because if you have a second grader, third grader, and it's your first time going through it, this is your first experience with a second grader or third grader. But a teacher of 25 years has seen a lot of children. And so ideally, if you have your kid has a good teacher, they are going to be able to have surveyed the landscape and be able to put your kid in context a little bit more. But I'd love for you to talk, just if you have another thought about kids who fly under the radar, because I suspect it is, those acting up ADHD kids are, and again, we always think it's boys, as you make the point, it's not just boys. What do we do for those kids who, we sense something, but they seem to fly under other people's radar?
Again, trusting our gut. And I think, you mentioned boys. Yeah, girls are notoriously underdiagnosed for ADHD and for autism spectrum disorders because they present differently. And so there's a whole generation of women who were missed as kids. And there's a lot of grief around being diagnosed as an adult and realizing that there was a real reason why you didn't thrive as a child, and that's a whole process that people have to go through. So yeah, I would just say, just push, advocate. If you really believe that your child is not thriving in some area, and it could be that they are more anxious, their mental health is suffering, their grades are they're not doing well with their grades, they're having social problems, they're not really connecting with peers. All of these things would be signs that there's probably something going on that is getting in their way. And there's so much support out there. That's the great news. Sometimes if we're looking for a more formal diagnosis, there can be long wait lists to get a full assessment or evaluation. But there are plenty of, therapists and counselors and parent coaches who could help get you on the right track to at least knowing where you would go next to get some more information. Again, we don't have to be chasing labels and diagnoses, but what we want to do is really understand what's getting in my kid's way. Like, if they're not thriving, what's going on? Is there something that is creating anxiety? Is there something, often it is these sensory or processing issues. Our slow processing speed is super stealth. People don't understand what it is. It's confounding. Really bright and gifted kids can have slow processing speed, and that is confusing. It explains so much, but people don't even know about it, and a lot of educators don't. So be vigilant, do research. And again, if you believe there's something going on, there probably is. I don't hear about a lot of parents trying to create problems where there are none,
Yeah, if I were to distill that down, it sounds to me like if things are unexpected, right? If you refer back to that asynchronous, that this is wonderful and this is really hard and surprisingly hard. And sure, I love the observation that kids be doing so great, particularly girls who present so well and then fly under the radar. I remember one of the very first students I had with learning difference, all processing speed, and this was 1994. So I was probably 20, I guess I was 24 at the time. And this boy had a conversation with us fascinating because not just slow processing speed in his own reading, but even just conversationally. And I'm like, holy smokes, I didn't know anything. I had no training. I didn't know what I was looking at. Fast forward, the kids ends up with, not that the SATs are everything, but an SAT score over 1,500 and runs off to Stanford. And so, a brilliant mind, but one that worked in ways that were unexpected. And so so to me, that feels like trust your gut. And if this is not what one would have expected, not I expect my kid to go to Harvard, but I see this and I see that, and those two things don't seem, consistent.
Yeah.
So the last 2/3 of the book are all about your 18 tilts. And I do not want to run through them. One, because I can't possibly give voice to them in the way that you have. And two, folks, you gotta get the book. You gotta read the book. But I'm wondering, is there one or two of these that have most resonated with people that, people from your tilt community have said, yeah, that's been the hard one, but has made such a difference for us?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is to understand that every child is on their own unique timeline. And that speaks to the disconnect you were just talking about. But that is a big one. They're all kind of related to fear at the end of the day, because we have a lot of fear if our child is not reaching milestones that society has deemed are important for any given age or grade. And this could be as little, and I talk about this in the book, as like, my child is not tying their shoes yet. Oh my gosh, what does this mean? They have to tie their shoes. And I'm like, that's what Velcro and zippers are for. And like, it just doesn't matter. And so the timeline tilt is really about, again, looking at the things that we are prioritizing as parents, those things that we think are so important, and then disputing them and thinking, what would happen if my kid didn't master this skill until they were 20? Do they absolutely need to know how to do this at age 10? Or am I just buying into some, mainstream philosophy or some clickbait article that I read, online about the 10 things every 13-year-old should know how to do? Like, it doesn't look that way. And so it's really important that we recognize ways that we might be not seeing or respecting who our child is and pushing them to do something that developmentally they're not ready to do. And we know that when we do that, it's going to backfire. We know we're going to create more resistance in our kids around that task. We may crush their desire to ever want to do it. And it doesn't end well. And I'm just going to give you a little example. So I mentioned that I homeschooled my child. It was from grades 3 through 8. And first, I was like, well, he's got to learn cursive, right? That's what you do in 3rd grade. And so I got the, Handwriting Without Tears book for cursive and, introduced this. He did it for like one day and was completely not into it. And it not just wasn't he into it, but he was very resistant. And so I was like, you know what? I don't care if you learn how to write cursive. It doesn't matter. I did some research. It's like, fine, let's work on the computer. Let's type things for now, because handwriting was super labor intensive for him. So flash forward like 5 years, and he has somehow, he's a deep dive. He loves everything, to learn about everything. And so he somehow got interested in like Spencerian scripts and started getting interested in typography and type design. And then I found him a typography instructor mentor, and she's really into calligraphy. So here we are today. He does beautiful calligraphy. He has this beautiful cursive handwriting, and he's so proud of it. And I guarantee if I had shoved that Handwriting Without Tears book down his throat, none of this would have happened. This love of typography and creative writing and handwriting. So that's just one little example. But when we give kids, the agency to and you write about this in your book, but when they're intrinsically motivated to learn something and they feel that drive, they will master it on their own time and feel amazing about it, right? And that's what we want.
Oh, that's such a wonderful story. It's such a wonderful story. And my brain was sort of flashing to all the articles that we've been seeing right now of how hard learning is and learning loss, and with COVID and hitting lower income communities even more than a higher community, and it's just hard, right? And all this fear of what's going to be lost, and will our kids ever catch up? And I think you just expressed it so beautifully, that because it isn't learned now doesn't mean it can't be learned, and that it won't be learned in the future. And I love that idea that we're all on our own timeline. And if we're delayed a little bit, delayed does not mean denied when it comes to things like learning, in part because everything is easier with a more mature brain, right? He probably, if he picked this up, 5 years, in 8th grade rather than 3rd grader, he may fly right through it and think, I'm a natural at this. And I love that you have the wisdom and the courage to say, it's okay. It doesn't matter. I don't have to do this, or I don't have to do this now. One of my well, again, to your point, a lot of these tilts, kind of morph together, but one of them was give voice to, but give loud and unapologetic voice to your own reality. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of people who may be listening to this, where I just, their experience right now, or their kids' experience might just be, I can't. I just I can't. Mm-hmm. And for us to be okay with that for now. Yeah. And because who knows, 3 or 5 years from now, we might have an entire country filled of curious learners and calligraphers.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be great? Right?
We're going to all go back to writing love letters. Valentine's Day's coming up, right?
Oh, goodness. Yeah. I mean, to your point, the articles that I'm seeing kind of go viral right now on social media are the ones where people are just saying, this is really hard and my life is a huge mess right now, and remote schooling is not going well, because it's so validating to hear from other people, oh gosh, I'm not the only one. And I think that's part of the thinking behind this tilt, is that in order for us to normalize difference, we need to just kind of talk about it matter-of-factly, not be secretive about it or treat it as if it's a dirty, secret that nobody needs to know about our families, mm-hmm. but rather this is our lives have value. This experience is real, and there's nothing wrong with it. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that my child is differently wired. He or she is exactly who he's or she or they mm-hmm. are supposed to mm-hmm. be. So why would we play small? So I really encourage parents to just kind of question where they're not fully showing up as themselves, and think about how might I push this paradigm shift further along if I were to more authentically kind of just normalize what our family's going through.
I love it. Well, you and I both know that one of the core attributes, contributors to intrinsic motivation, is relatedness. And so for us to really, embrace our kids for who they are, that is actually give them the juice to engage with things that might be harder to engage with. And certainly for families who have kids who are differently wired, and really for everyone, this is very much a book I think that we can all relate to. Debbie Reber is the author of Differently Wired, A Parent's Guide to Raising an Atypical Child with Confidence and Hope. It is a great book. I hope people pick it up and join the TIL community, particularly if you have a kid who needs a little bit more support. It just means that you need a little bit more support. And Debbie has built a robust and remarkable community of parents supporting remarkable kids. It is a pleasure to have you today, Debbie.
Thank you so much, Ned. I love this conversation.
Thank you for listening to Prep Talks. Please subscribe to us for free at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.